Today, we're exploring the terror that could be living next door with 7 chilling stories about strange neighbors. Get ready to hear disturbing stories about people who discovered that those living just a few meters away are not always who they seem to be. Let's delve into stories of suspicious behavior, macabre discoveries, and terrifying situations that literally happened in the backyard next door. So sit back, make sure your doors are locked securely, and let's begin this spine-chilling journey. Oh, and before your strange neighbor shows up, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like. This really helps the channel and ensures you don't miss out on any terrifying content like this. Let's go. The window next door. The case of Clara Weber was documented by Hamburg police as one of the most disturbing residential disappearance and stalking incidents in the city's recent history. The events of that summer were reconstructed from testimonies, camera records, and reports from residents of the building. Clara, 29, a journalist who had recently arrived in the city, rented a small apartment in the Eimsbüttel neighborhood. The building was old, with large windows and silent corridors. In the first few weeks, he noticed something uncomfortable. Every night, when he closed the curtains, he saw his neighbor from the building opposite, a middle-aged man with the lights always off, standing at the window staring at his apartment. At first, Clara tried to ignore it. He changed the hours, changed the curtains to blackout models, but whenever I peeked in, there he was, motionless, staring. He commented to co-workers who laughed. He must be a bored loner. But the annoyance grew when he realized that on the days he forgot the window open, he found objects out of place when he returned home. Books moved from the shelf, a mug moved, the laptop out of sleep mode. One night, when he arrived home early from work, he found the building's superintendent, Herr Kruger, talking to his neighbor by the window. Upon noticing Clara, the man looked away and quickly entered his apartment. Kruger, always helpful, said nothing. "It's just Mr. Muller. He's lived here for decades. He doesn't hurt anyone." Determined to understand what was happening, Clara discreetly installed a camera on the windowsill. The next morning, when reviewing the images, he saw the neighbor watching his apartment for hours, writing something down in a notebook. More disturbing, at one point, he looked directly into the camera lens, smiling slightly as if he knew he was being recorded. That same week, Clara went to research the building's history and found old reports on local forums about mysterious disappearances of tenants, always young women, over the last 20 years. The stories had a pattern. They all lived in apartments overlooking Mr. Muller's building. Scared, Clara decided to confront him. He waited for the man to leave for the market and approached him in the hallway. He just smiled, saying, "You should close the curtains at night. You never know who might be watching." The tone was threatening, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. That night, he heard footsteps in the hallway and noises coming from the apartment next door. When he looked through the peephole, he saw Müller standing in front of his door, holding the notebook. He remained there for minutes, whispering something that Clara couldn't understand. Then he disappeared into the hallway. The next day, Clara tried to talk to other residents. He discovered that 2 upstairs neighbors had hastily moved out months earlier, citing personal reasons. One of them, Anna, never handed over the keys. She simply disappeared, leaving no trace. The case was not investigated in depth, as Anna was a foreigner and had no family in the city. Feeling increasingly threatened, Clara took the images and reports to the police. Authorities were initially hesitant to act, citing a lack of concrete evidence, but after insistence and with the support of a fellow journalist, they obtained authorization to investigate Müller's apartment. During the search, they found a locked room full of personal objects from former residents of the building: diaries, clothes, photographs, jewelry. In a cabinet, there was a list of names and dates, all corresponding to missing women, including Anna. Miller's notebook contained detailed notes about Clara's and other neighbors' habits, arrival and departure times, preferences, and even apartment plans. In the basement, police located a camouflaged trap door. There, they found the remains and belongings of at least 4 women who had disappeared in the last 10 years. Müller was arrested when he tried to escape through the service exit, but he offered no resistance, limiting himself to saying, "They never knew they were being watched until it was too late." The case shocked Hamburg and led to a review of security policies in residential buildings, including mandatory cameras in common areas and greater rigor in investigating disappearances. For Clara, the experience left deep marks. "The most terrifying thing," she reported, "was realizing that it wasn't just paranoia. Someone was actually studying me, waiting for a slip-up, and had done this before. The danger was there, in plain sight, but no one wanted to see it." The story of the window next door has become a grim warning for residents of big cities. Sometimes the greatest danger is not on the streets, but in the window opposite, silently waiting for the next inattentive glance. The Night Manager, the Mirador building case, was documented by the Catalan police as one of the most disturbing episodes of invasion of privacy and persecution in a condominium environment in the city's recent history. The events of that summer were reconstructed based on testimonies from residents, security camera images, and digital records. At the beginning of August, residents of Mirador began to notice strange behavior from the property manager, Javier Salinas, a 58-year-old man, discreet and apparently helpful. He made nightly rounds of the building, citing security concerns due to recent thefts in neighboring neighborhoods. What seemed like excessive zeal soon became disturbing. Reports of apartment doors ajar in the morning, personal objects out of place, and the feeling of being watched grew among condominium owners. The uneasiness increased when Lucia, a young architect on the 7th floor, noticed that Javier passed by her door several times a night, something recorded by a newly installed doorbell camera. Suspicious, she spoke to other neighbors and discovered that she was not the only one. At least 5 residents reported similar situations, mainly women who lived alone. Determined to understand what was happening, Lucia discreetly installed a camera in the hallway pointed at her door. In less than a week, he captured images of Javier using a master key to enter his apartment at 3 in the morning. He stayed for about 15 minutes, leaving as calmly as he entered. Lucia took the images to the police and, with judicial authorization, installed cameras in other parts of the building. What they discovered was even more disturbing. Javier made nightly patrols on every floor, entering specific apartments while residents slept. In his office, they found a panel with a map of the building, detailed schedules for each resident, records of habits and notes such as absent on Wednesdays, arrives late, easy door. Even more alarming, there was a list of targets, residents that Javier monitored with special attention, with observations about schedules, routines, and perceived vulnerabilities. Among the documents, the police found records of private conversations, copies of keys, and even personal belongings of residents, such as photos, correspondence, and underwear. The investigation revealed that Javier had installed hidden cameras in common areas and, in some cases, inside apartments, hidden in smoke detectors or fake sockets. He used the privileged access of a building manager to enter the units, justifying himself with supposed maintenance or routine inspections. Over the course of 3 years, he collected a detailed dossier on the lives of dozens of residents, monitoring them in real time and selecting those he considered interesting for closer observation. The case only came to light because Lucia, when reviewing the images, noticed that Javier not only observed but also manipulated personal objects, swapped items, and in some cases removed small belongings. Other residents reported the disappearance of jewelry, documents, and even money, but they never suspected the property manager. When confronted, Javier tried to claim that he was acting to protect the residents and that his notes were only to ensure the security of the building. However, faced with the evidence, he confessed that his obsession had started after a traumatic divorce, leading him to seek control over other people's lives. Police also discovered that, in at least 2 cases, residents who tried to confront Javier or formally complain about his excessive patrols mysteriously disappeared. Although no direct evidence of crime was found, the disappearances remain under investigation. The case provoked outrage in Barcelona and led to a review of local laws on apartment managers' access, reinforcing the need for express authorization and monitoring by third parties in any entry outside of emergency situations. It also increased supervision over the use of cameras in common areas, restricting access to images only for real security situations and with formal authorization. 4. Lucia and the other residents, the experience left deep marks. The scariest thing, she reported, was realizing that we had entrusted our safety to someone who was actually watching us and manipulating our lives. He knew everything about us, our schedules, our fears, even what we kept in each drawer. The Mirador building implemented new access rules, changed all locks, and installed a monitoring system audited by an external company. Javier Salinas was convicted of invasion of privacy, theft and abuse of trust, and is awaiting trial on suspicion of involvement in the disappearances. The story of the night manager has become a warning for condominiums across Spain. The real threat, sometimes, is not outside the gates, but walks silently through the corridors with a set of keys and a friendly smile. Apartment 303. The case of Apartment 303 was documented by the Lisbon Judicial Police as one of the most disturbing episodes of human trafficking in a residential environment in the city's recent history. The events came to light after complaints from a young resident, Tiago Almeida, aged 24, a university student and resident in the building for just over a year. Over the course of several weeks, Tiago began to notice strange noises coming from apartment 303 at the end of the third-floor hallway. Muffled knocks during the early hours, voices in foreign languages, sounds of furniture being dragged and sometimes choked screams. The resident of 303, a solitary man named Victor Novak, kept to himself and was rarely seen during the day, only coming out at night for quick walks or to receive bulky deliveries. Tiago's uneasiness increased when he noticed a pattern. Different people, almost always young women and teenagers, entered the building accompanied by Victor, but were rarely seen leaving. Some seemed scared, carrying few things, always looking down. One night, Tiago saw one of them trying to ask for help through the hallway window, but being quickly pulled back into the apartment. Suspicious, Tiago tried to talk to other neighbors, but encountered resistance and fear. Many preferred not to get involved, claiming that it was none of their business or that they didn't want any problems. Only Donna Isabel, a lady on the second floor, admitted to having heard screams and seen marks of blood on the stairs, but never reported it for fear of reprisals. Determined to act, Tiago began recording the times of movement in 303, writing down license plates of rental cars that frequently stopped on the street and discreetly filming the entrances and exits of the building. After gathering videos and reports, he contacted the police, who initially treated the case as possible domestic violence. The situation changed when Tiago, as he passed through the hallway, smelled a strong smell of chemicals and heard crying. Coming from the apartment. That night, a young woman managed to escape and, desperate, asked Tiago for help. She spoke little Portuguese, but managed to explain that she'd been deceived with a promise of a job and held prisoner for weeks, forced to work in degrading conditions and threatened with death if she tried to escape. The police were called immediately. The investigation revealed that Viktor Novak was part of an international human trafficking network, using apartment 303 as a transit point and temporary captivity for victims recently arrived in Europe. Victims were recruited from countries in Eastern Europe, Africa, and South America, with promises of employment in hotels, restaurants, or as nannies. When they arrived in Lisbon, their documents were confiscated. They were kept in prison and subjected to threats, violence, and sexual or labor exploitation. The police operation found clear signs of trafficking in apartment 303, reinforced locks, internal bars, dirty mattresses, syringes, forged documents, and lists of names and dates. On Victor's computer, there were detailed records of routes, contacts of other members of the network, and payments received by each victim dispatched to other European countries. The case fit international standards of human trafficking, involving recruitment, transportation, housing, and exploitation of victims, generally through coercion, threats, and abuse of vulnerability. The investigation also revealed that the building had previously been used by other members of the network, who changed identities and apartments to make police action more difficult. Neighbors' silence, fear of reprisals, and lack of complaints made it easier for criminals to act for years. Viktor Novak was arrested in the act, and subsequently, 3 other members of the network were detained in different cities in Portugal and Spain. The rescued victims received psychological support, shelter, and assistance in regularizing documents as provided for in international guidelines for the protection of victims of human trafficking. The case of apartment 303 exposed the complexity of human trafficking, a crime that involves multiple actors, international routes, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. Tiago's actions were fundamental in breaking the cycle of silence and fear that kept the scheme hidden, showing the importance of society's engagement and reporting to combat this type of crime. For the building's residents, the experience left deep marks. The scariest thing, reported Tiago, was realizing that the horror was happening just a few meters from my door and that the silence of the neighbors allowed everything to continue for so long. The case led to a review of policies for reporting and protecting victims of trafficking in Lisbon, with awareness campaigns and training for property managers, doormen, and residents of residential condominiums. The story of apartment 303 became a warning for European cities. Human trafficking can be hidden in broad daylight, behind ordinary doors, in seemingly quiet buildings, just waiting for someone to have the courage to look and act. What's up, guys? The stories of strange neighbors are chilling even now, aren't they? If you're enjoying these scary stories, how about taking a quick stop and subscribing to the channel? Just click the sign up button below and take the opportunity to leave your like too. This really helps the channel grow and motivates me to continue bringing you more terrifying content like this. It's quick and makes all the difference. Now, shall we get back to our stories of disturbing neighbors? There's still a lot of terror ahead. 4. The Perfect Garden. The Pearson family case was documented by Greater Manchester Police as one of the most disturbing incidents involving residential neighborhoods in the city's recent history. The events of those 3 months were reconstructed. From survivors' statements, forensic evidence, and neighbors' records, Sarah and David Pearson, along with their 10-year-old twin children Emma and Jack, moved into a 2-story house on quiet Oakwood Lane in March 2025. The property seemed perfect. Spacious garden, tree-lined street, and seemingly calm neighborhood. The only detail that caught his attention was the stark contrast between his unkempt garden and that of the neighbor next door. An immaculate lawn with perfectly aligned beds and not a single leaf out of place. It was as if an invisible line divided the properties, Sarah later reported. On one side, our common garden, on the other, an almost artificial perfection. The neighbor, Harold Thompson, a man in his 60s, widowed and retired, came forward the day after the move. He brought a homemade cake and offered tips on gardening. "You're going to want to take care of that lawn soon," he said, smiling, as he looked at the Pearsons' garden. Weeds spread quickly. In the early days, the family found Harold eccentric but harmless. He spent hours in his garden, mowing the grass, pruning bushes, and removing any fallen leaves with almost obsessive precision. What started to get annoying was the noise from the lawnmower, a particularly noisy gasoline model that Harold started at 8 a.m. at least 3 times a week, even when the lawn looked perfectly trimmed. "He would take hours," David explained. "I stopped, started again, measured with a ruler, cut again. It was like a ritual." When David gently mentioned the noise, suggesting later hours on weekends, Harold smiled politely and said, "I understand your concern, but gardens require dedication." The Wilsons complained too when they moved. They no longer live here. The family soon discovered that several previous neighbors had suddenly moved away after brief stays. No one on the street seemed to know exactly where they went or why. Stranger still, no one questioned the constant noise of Harold's lawnmower. The situation took a darker turn when Jack, as curious as any 10-year-old, told his parents that he had seen Harold digging deep in his garden at night. He had a flashlight on his head and was burying something big wrapped in plastic, the boy said. Sarah, worried, began researching the previous residents of the house. He discovered that over the past 5 years, 3 different families had occupied the property, all leaving abruptly without leaving any contacts. As he discreetly questioned other neighbors, he noticed that everyone seemed evasive when it came to Harold or the former residents. One night, as David was taking out the trash, he noticed something disturbing. Harold was in his garden at 11 p.m., carefully removing dirt from under a newly planted bush. Realizing he was being watched, Harold nodded casually and said, "Roses need special soil. I have my own fertilizer." The family began documenting Harold's nighttime activities. They noticed a pattern. After each nighttime planting, a new section of the garden bloomed with unusual vigor. The roses were particularly vibrant, with intense colors that looked unnatural. The turning point occurred when Emma found, partially buried at the edge of the gardens, what appeared to be a wristwatch. Sarah recognized it from a photo she had seen. It belonged to Robert Wilson, the previous resident who had moved out after complaining about the noise. David contacted the police, who were initially skeptical. However, after insistence and mention of uninvestigated disappearances, they agreed to check Harold's garden with sniffer dogs, under the pretext of a search for drugs in the neighborhood. What they found confirmed the family's worst fears. Beneath Harold's immaculate garden, police discovered the human remains of at least 5 people, all buried at different depths, some already completely decomposed and embedded in the soil. Among the remains, they identified belongings of former neighbors, including the Wilsons, who had moved away 3 years earlier. Harold was arrested without resistance, smiling serenely as he was led away. In his barn, police found a meticulous diary detailing each addition to the garden, with dates, names, and even the complaints that had justified their actions. They also found an elaborate system for processing human remains into fertilizer, explaining the extraordinary vigor of their plants. For the Pearson family, the experience left deep scars. The most disturbing thing, Sarah reflected, was realizing that we lived next door to a killer who used his victims to feed his roses, and that the entire neighborhood had somehow become accustomed to this, preferring to ignore the signs rather than confront the horror. The case has led to a review of uninvestigated disappearances across the Manchester region, with new guidelines for monitoring sudden changes in residential areas. And for the residents of Oakwood Lane, the story of the perfect garden serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the obsession with perfection can hide the most terrible secrets and that the true horror may be growing, literally, in the garden next door. Harold Thompson was diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and psychopathy and was sentenced to multiple life sentences. The garden was completely excavated, revealing evidence of crimes dating back more than a decade. The silent party, the Martinez couple's case, was documented by the Kansas City Police Department as one of the most disturbing residential kidnapping incidents in the city's recent history. The events of that night were reconstructed from survivors' statements, forensic evidence, and police records. Elena and Miguel Martinez, newly arrived in the city, had moved into an apartment in the Westport neighborhood just 2 weeks ago. The building was old, with narrow corridors and thin walls. On Friday, April 11th, they found a smart invitation under their door. Welcome party, apartment 4B. Saturday, 8 p.m. Smart casual attire, quiet appreciated. We thought the request for silence was strange, but we thought maybe it was because of an elderly resident or baby in the building, Eleanor later reported. Plus, it seemed like a good opportunity to get to know the neighbors. On Saturday night, the couple knocked on the door of 4B and were greeted by a middle-aged man, Robert, and his wife, Sarah. The apartment was impeccably decorated with low lighting and classical music at an almost imperceptible volume. The strangest thing, however, was the absolute silence of the other guests. About 8 people sitting rigidly on sofas and armchairs with fixed smiles and vacant looks. Nobody talked, Miguel recalled. When I tried to start a conversation with the man next to me, he just smiled and nodded without saying a word. Robert quickly approached and explained that it was a silent party, a concept he was testing out. The couple were served glasses of red wine, which Elena only pretended to drink, uncomfortable with the situation. While Robert was distracted by other guests, she noticed Sarah discreetly administering injections into the arm of a young woman who appeared drowsy. When asked, Sarah smiled tightly and said it was just insulin for diabetes. The host's behavior became more suspicious when Miguel asked to use the bathroom and was joined by Robert, who waited outside. Upon returning to the room, Elena noticed that 2 of the guests had been taken to another room where muffled sounds were coming from. That's when I noticed the marks on the wrists of a woman sitting next to me, said Elena. They were injuries, consistent with handcuffs or ropes. His eyes were begging for help. Pretending to need fresh air, the couple went out into the hallway, where they quickly discussed the situation. They decided to call the police, but when they tried to leave the building, they found Robert blocking the stairs. The party has barely started, he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You are special guests. You can't go yet. Sensing the danger, Miguel feigned compliance while Elena discreetly sent her location to her brother via cell phone with the message, "Emergency. Call the police. Apartment 4B. The couple returned to the party, where Robert offered more wine, insisting they drink it. He watched until we swallowed, reported Miguel. I noticed that the wine had a bitter taste, probably some sedative. Over the next few minutes, Elena began to feel dizzy, but Miguel, who had managed to spill part of the drink on a plant, remained alert. When Sarah announced that she would take Elena to rest in one of the rooms, Miguel created a distraction by knocking over a bookshelf. In the confusion, he managed to reach the apartment door, but was stopped by Robert, who was now wielding a syringe. The arrival of the police, alerted by Elena's brother, interrupted the confrontation. Authorities found 5 people in different rooms of the apartment, all sedated and showing signs of prolonged captivity. A search revealed a back room equipped with cameras, medical instruments, and detailed records of previous guests, some dating back months. The investigation revealed that Robert and Sarah carefully selected their targets, often newcomers, to the city, couples without immediate family, or socially isolated people. Victims were sedated during the silent parties, held captive for weeks or months, and eventually transported to unknown locations. Records in a notebook suggested a connection to human trafficking. Even more disturbing, police discovered that the couple had held similar parties in 3 other cities over the past 5 years, each time changing identities after a few months. Evidence linked Robert to at least a dozen unsolved disappearances. For Elena and Miguel Martinez, the experience left deep scars. The most terrifying thing, Elena reflected, was realizing how something seemingly normal, an invitation from neighbors, could be a front for something so horrible. And to think that, if we hadn't suspected, we could have been the next victims. The case prompted an overhaul of Kansas City's missing person investigation protocols, with particular attention paid to patterns involving newcomers to the city and suspicious social events. And for residents of apartment buildings, the story of the silent party serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the closest danger can be hidden behind a polite invitation and a warm smile, just waiting for the door to close behind its next victims. Robert and Sarah were identified as members of a human trafficking ring operating in the American Midwest. Both are awaiting trial on multiple charges of kidnapping, forced administration of substances, and human trafficking. The locked garage, the Perry Street garage case, was documented by the Houston Police Department as one of the most disturbing captivity and kidnapping incidents in the city's recent history. The events that unfolded on that property were reconstructed from victims' statements, police evidence, and neighbors' records. In the quiet neighborhood of South Union, 3 children, Mateo, 12 years old, his sister Lucia, 10, and their friend Darius, 11, often played in the street, observing the neighborhood's movements. They noticed something strange in the house on the corner. The owner, a middle-aged man who presented himself as a musician, never opened the garage to park his car, always leaving the vehicle in the driveway. We thought it was strange because it was the only house on the street where the garage never opened, Mateo later reported, and sometimes, late at night, we would hear muffled sounds coming from there. The owner, 52-year-old Lee Carter, was known in the neighborhood as a reserved man who rarely socialized. Some neighbors recognized him as Viper, a local rapper with videos on YouTube, but few had direct contact with him. The children's curiosity grew when they noticed that Carter often arrived late at night, sometimes carrying bags of food or other supplies into the garage, entering through a side door that he kept carefully locked. One time, we saw him taking a woman inside, said Lucia. She looked sick or very tired. We never saw her leave. After weeks of observing the suspicious routine, the children decided to investigate more closely. One Saturday afternoon, while Carter was out, they approached the garage and peered through a small crack in the window, which was partially covered with wooden boards. What they saw horrified them. In the dark and stuffy interior, there was a dirty mattress, a bucket that seemed to serve as a makeshift toilet, and what appeared to be an extremely thin woman, lying motionless. Scared, they ran to Darius's house and told his parents, who were initially hesitant to believe the story. However, Darius's father, a former police officer, decided to check the situation. As he approached the property, he also heard groaning sounds coming from the garage and immediately contacted authorities. Police quickly arrived and, after confirming the suspicious sounds, obtained a search warrant. What they found confirmed their worst fears. A severely malnourished woman, weighing just 32 pounds, was being held captive in the garage. The space had nailed-in windows, a makeshift bathroom that didn't work, and deplorable sanitary conditions. The victim, whose name has been protected, revealed that she had been approached by Carter while asking for money on the street. He offered help, but instead kidnapped her and held her prisoner for almost 5 years, subjecting her to constant physical and sexual abuse, as well as forcing her to use drugs to keep her docile. More disturbingly, the investigation revealed that Carter meticulously documented his captivity on video, which he stored on a laptop. Police found dozens of files showing the victim's physical deterioration over the years, as well as evidence that he had kept other women in similar situations. A second victim soon came forward, reporting that she had been kidnapped and abused by Carter in 2021, confirming the pattern of predatory behavior. The investigation revealed that the main victim had tried to escape several times. On one occasion, he was able to use a messaging app on Carter's laptop to contact police. Although she was rescued and taken to the hospital, Carter managed to pick her up and bring her back to captivity. After this attempt, he reinforced the windows with boards to prevent future escapes. For the children who initially discovered the horror, the experience was traumatic, but also transformative. The scariest thing, Mateo reflected, was realizing that something so terrible was happening right next to where we played every day, and no one noticed. The case shocked the South Union community, prompting a wave of welfare checks at suspicious residences and a community watch program. It also exposed flaws in the emergency response system, as the victim had previously managed to contact authorities without receiving adequate support. Lee Carter was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment, facing the possibility of life in prison. The main victim, after prolonged hospitalization and rehabilitation, slowly began the process of physical and psychological recovery. And for Houstonians, the story of the locked garage serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the deepest horrors can be hidden in plain sight behind closed doors in ordinary neighborhoods, waiting for someone, even children, to have the courage to look closer and report it. Carter's case joins other similar incidents recently documented, such as that of Laura Cowan, who was held captive in a garage for 4 years, and the Waterbury case, where a man was held captive in his own bedroom for decades by his stepmother, stories that expose the disturbing reality of people held captive in ordinary residential settings. 7. The anonymous note, the Mirador building case, was documented by the São Paulo Civil Police as one of the most disturbing episodes of systematic threats and harassment in a residential environment in the city's recent history. The events of that month were reconstructed from residents' testimonies, forensic evidence, and security camera records. It all started when residents on the 5th floor found small notes slipped under their doors. The messages, written in letters cut out of magazines, contained unsettling phrases such as, "I know when you sleep, and I've been watching you for years." Initially, residents believed it was a bad joke, possibly carried out by a teenager in the building. However, the following week, the notes became more specific and threatening. "I saw you arrive late yesterday, Marina. Red suits you." Or, "Your son is growing up, Paulo. It would be a shame if something happened to him." The situation worsened when residents realized that the notes mentioned intimate details of their routines that only someone very close to them could know. The property manager called an emergency meeting where they discovered that notes were being received on all floors, always with precise references to the residents' private lives. The police were called, but without concrete evidence of a crime, they only registered the incident as a threat. It was Carla, a literature teacher on the 8th floor, who first suspected Antonio, the resident of apartment 302. He had lived in the building for over 15 years, but no one knew anything about him, she later reported. He was so discreet that many didn't even know his full name. Antonio Soares, 57 years old, was known only as the Gentleman of 302, a quiet man who politely greeted his neighbors but never participated in meetings or get-togethers. He worked at home as a translator, rarely received visitors, and always used the same bench in the building's garden, from where he had a privileged view of the main entrance and the leisure area. Suspicion increased when Carla, reviewing the newly installed security cameras, noticed that Antonio often remained in the floor hall for long periods, apparently for no reason. In some recordings, he appeared to look closely at apartment doors or examine other people's mail. Meanwhile, the notes continued, now with more explicit threats. "You will be the next to disappear." The tension reached its peak when the dog of a resident on the 4th floor was found dead in the garden, with a similar note attached to its collar. A group of residents decided to investigate on their own. They discovered that Antonio had moved into the building shortly after leaving prison, where he had served time for non-violent crimes, information that he had omitted when renting the apartment. Even more disturbing, his real name was different, and he had changed his identity after leaving prison. The police, now with more concrete evidence, obtained a search warrant. In apartment 302, they found a room transformed into a veritable surveillance center. Walls covered with photos of the residents taken without consent, detailed notes on the routines, habits and vulnerabilities of each family, and dozens of newspaper and magazine clippings, the source of the letters used in the notes. In a secret compartment under the floorboards, investigators discovered personal items stolen from the apartments over the years, from small jewelry to intimate diaries and family photographs. More alarmingly, they found documents relating to 3 people who had disappeared in the last 5 years, all from neighboring buildings where Antonio had previously lived. The investigation revealed that Antonio Suarez, whose real name was Ricardo Mendez, had served time for home invasion and voyeurism, but was suspected of involvement in disappearances that were never solved. After leaving prison, he developed a calculated method. He moved into a building, spent years observing the residents, collecting information and objects, until he selected vulnerable victims. The notes were part of their game, a way of testing reactions and identifying who would pose the least risk when attacked. He created a climate of collective fear to observe who showed greater fragility, explained the delegate responsible for the case. For the residents of the Mirador building, the experience left deep scars. The most terrifying thing, Carla reflected, was realizing that we lived next to someone who studied us methodically, who knew our fears and secrets, and who was just waiting for the right moment to act. The case led to a review of background check policies in residential condominiums in São Paulo, with new requirements for identifying and monitoring suspicious behavior. And for the thousands of people who live in apartment buildings, the story of the anonymous note serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the closest danger may be that discreet neighbor who has always been there, silently watching, gathering information, and patiently waiting for the moment to turn threats into action. Ricardo Mendez was charged with threats, stalking, home invasion, and is being investigated for possible involvement in the disappearances. The case remains ongoing, with investigators looking for connections to other similar crimes in the region. And so we come to the end of our 7 horror stories about strange neighbors. So, what did you think? Which story gave you the most goosebumps? Will any of them make you look differently at that quiet neighbor in the next apartment? Tell me in the comments which one was your favorite. If you enjoyed this dive into the terrifying world of strange neighbors, don't forget to leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing more scary content like this. And if you are not yet registered, take the opportunity now to sign up and activate the bell.